It is my honor to present a person that's become a good friend, and there's an interesting Northwood connection here. My roommate in college, Mark Warner, is the person that introduced me to your next speaker. My roommate went on and did his master's degree in computer science. It was an interesting combination for him, and he went to work for really a strategic business unit of IBM and moved to Boston, met a wonderful girl, had the pleasure of being in his wedding, and through Mark and Mary Beth, the Warners got to know John O'Leary and John's family, and my roommate, his nickname is Pick because he had the same number as Brian Piccolo. We played football together, and Pick said to me, he says, "Timmy, you got to get to know John O'Leary. He's this really sharp guy. He's one of the few free market guys at Harvard, and great guy, great thinker." And I've had the privilege of getting to know John over the last couple of years. I've worked with him, and some of the things that he does at Harvard, and I can tell you, you are in for a real treat this evening. John O'Leary has an undergraduate degree from MIT, has a master's degree from the University of Massachusetts. He has worked in private industry in a number of different sectors. He is currently a researcher and a scholar at the Ash Institute, or the Ash Center, at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is a sought-after speaker. He has had his articles published in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and a number of other major publications. He's received a lot of attention in the last couple of years for his book, If You Can Put a Man on the Moon, and the book has done quite well, and it really is a book that asks us to look at the fact that if we can put a human being on the moon, why can't we have more logical or more rational public policy? And why can't we do things better, faster, cheaper? And in his responsibility at Harvard, he is the executive editor of Better, Faster, Cheaper, and Governing. Now, these are publications that are available online at the Harvard Ash Center website. And he is just he's not only a warm and friendly human being, but he is a person that is a real intellectual, and he is also an individual that recently decided that if I'm going to make a difference, maybe one of the things that I need to do is take a look at running for the State House in Massachusetts. And he ran for the State House this past fall in Massachusetts in a highly Democratic district. He didn't win, or we'd have to pay him a lot more for him to be here. But he actually got 45% of the vote in a largely Democratic district. So he's going to talk today about the findings in his book and the things that he's doing at the Ash Center. But I would encourage you to be looking at the different angles and regarding public policy, and take use of this great resource. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome John O'Leary.
Tim, thank you. Thank you, Tim, for that great introduction. And just to be clear, Tim is my wife's cousin's husband's college roommate. So I think that means we're practically family. And it's been great to know Tim these past few years, and great to be here today. You've had a tremendous lineup of speakers. I feel sort of overwhelmed in terms of trying to continue to feed the font of knowledge that has been flowing over the past few days. So hopefully we'll have some fun tonight talking about how do you get big things done in government. So if we can put a man on the moon, why can't we have killer robot police? Tim was mentioning that this idea of if we can put a man on the moon is one that you hear a lot. You know, if we can put a man on the moon, why can't we cure homelessness, or why can't we cure cancer and all these things? But, back, I want to talk and take everybody back 50 years ago, this month, in fact, and think about what things were like in 1961. In 1961, the idea of going to the moon was just that. It was an idea. And in fact, it was kind of a grandiose idea because at the time, it was the Soviet Union that was ahead of us in the space race, right? And in 1961, the moon was really a metaphor for being able to do big things. So at the time, the United States was locked in a huge ideological battle with who? Who was the big nemesis? Russia, the Soviet Union. And it wasn't just a rival country, it was a rival ideology. The big question that was looming out there was which system of government could get big things done? Was it freedom and free markets and democracy, or was it communism and totalitarianism and socialism? Because there's a lot of advantages when it comes to getting big things done in a totalitarian system, right? You don't have to have meetings, you don't have to have votes, you just have somebody say, we're going to do this, and it gets done. So the Soviet Union had really shocked America in 1957 when they put a satellite in orbit. Anybody know the name of that first satellite? Sputnik, very good. Sputnik hit in 1957. They also put the first female in space, who was Laika the dog. This is an actual photograph of Laika the dog, the first female in space. And this is a statue to Laika that is in Moscow. And then in April of 1961, this fellow, the first cosmonaut, whose name is John Glenn. No, that would be an American astronaut. Yuri Gagarin. Who's over here? Are you from Russia? No. Okay. Okay. All right. You're not one of these communist types that are okay. All right. So in 1961, I want you to remember, John F. Kennedy takes office in January of 1961, and then in April of 1961, just a few months later, the Soviets put Yuri Gagarin into orbit. And then this happens also in April of 1961. Anybody know what this is? No? No? Close. It's obviously military. Things are going badly for U.S.-backed forces against another communist in this hemisphere. This is the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. So in April of 1961, in one week, Yuri Gagarin is circling the globe, and Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow is boasting about how awesome communism is. The following week, the U.S.-backed forces get slaughtered on the beaches of Cuba and the Bay of Pigs, and Fidel Castro, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, is crowing about what an awesome system of government socialism is, and we've shown up these weak Americans, and 1 month later, in fact, almost 50 years ago to the day, it was May 25th, 1961, almost 50 years ago to the day, John Kennedy took the opportunity to go before a joint session of Congress and make a big speech. I believe that this nation should commit itself to the goal, before the decade is out, of putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No other space project in this time will be more impressive to mankind. We do not choose to go to the moon and do the other things because they are easy, but because they are hard. All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. They have a course on that at the Harvard Kennedy School where they actually teach you how to do that, so everybody can do it. But it was an amazing, a bold challenge, and part of it was a demonstration project. We're doing it because it's hard. We're doing it because we need to show the world that democracy can function as well as socialism, that freedom and free markets are a great system and are capable of achieving great things. And before the decade ended, Neil Armstrong plants that American flag on the moon, and the United States has a tremendous triumph. And this is an achievement that's like, Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic, climbing Mount Everest, all rolled into one. A huge technological achievement from a place where the Soviets were well ahead of us. It's been 40 years later, and still no other country has gotten to the moon. it is truly an amazing feat. And this is the feeling. And when I was a little kid, I remember things like this. These are the astronauts. These are public employees getting a ticker tape parade down the streets of New York City. There was a sense of national pride, and there was a lot of reasons to be proud in this nation. When this picture is taken in 1969, in the prior 25 years, think about what the United States of America had done. They had won World War II. They had split the atom in the Manhattan Project. They had done the Berlin airlift. They had restored democracy to Japan. They had held the line against communism in the Korean War. They'd done the National Highway Project, and yes, they put a man on the moon. So this was a nation that was used to doing great things. You know, we were this myth of the unstoppable American system. There was pride in democracy and everything else. How have things been going lately with Iraq and Katrina and the Big Dig up in Boston and the financial meltdown and this just general sense of government unable to accomplish significant tasks, a system of government that you start to call into question? People start saying things like, you know, China has these bullet trains that go 140 miles an hour all over the country. How come we can't do stuff like that? How come we, you know, when we do something big, it's cash for clunkers? You know, it's like, and I think that, you know, that was as much as anything what drove our decision to research this question. How can a system of government that produces such great successes be in a situation where it's struggling so badly? And so what we did is we looked at a whole bunch of projects. And one of the things we did is we asked senior officials in government, okay, so that we took the senior officials in government and said, you know what's going on. What do you think? And 60% of them told us that government is less capable of executing today than it was 30 or 50 years ago. So these are the senior officials of government. This isn't like right-wing talk radio, right? These aren't some cranks. These are you know, senior managers in the public sector workforce. So why do some big initiatives succeed and some fail? And that was really the sort of basis. We looked at 75 different undertakings, from the Vietnam War to a whole bunch of other public sector initiatives to try to find patterns. And we put it in the book, If We Can Put a Man on the Moon. And what we found was that every public undertaking goes through a journey. It starts with an idea. You have to have an idea. And then it has to have a design. So you have to have a legislative, usually, design on how you're going to approach this idea. Then we have what we call the moment of democratic commitment, or the Stargate. And this is pretty unique to the public sector. It doesn't exist in the private sector. But that's the moment at which democracy makes a commitment to do something. So when Kennedy was making his speech, he was sort of launching the idea, but it wasn't until Congress dedicated the money to a moon landing, or a moon, you know, to the NASA program, that the democratic commitment occurred. Same thing with something like the health care reform that we saw not that long ago. The idea has been around there for a while. Then it went through the legislative process with a bill. The 2,000-page health care reform bill was written down. But it wasn't until it passed both houses of Congress and Barack Obama signed it that it became law. And we call it the Stargate because the minute a bill becomes a law, it goes from the political universe, where politicians are dealing with it, to the bureaucratic universe. So as soon as that health care bill becomes a law, it gets turned over to the bureaucracy. It gets turned over to the Department of Health and Human Services and the IRS to collect the taxes and all of the official execution of government. And then after implementation, then you have to see that if you get the results that you were shooting for. And this pattern, you know, we went through each of these patterns and we found 7 traps, 7 potential failures that government fell prey to at various stages along the journey. Because this journey is like a chain, in that if any link of the chain is flawed, the journey will not be a success. So in order to have success in the overall journey from idea to result, you must have success every single point along the way. If you make a mistake anywhere, you will get failure. What we found was these undertakings failed at all these different points. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the ideas that we saw and some of the examples that we looked at. So first thing is the war on inflation. And if people have questions, you know, feel free to ask during things, because I know you do a lot of listening. So if I screw something up or you don't understand something, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to pause at any point. So in 1972, after a very stable period of price inflation in the 1960s, inflation started to hit around 5 to 6%. And this was considered a big problem for reasons that Dr. Ebeling talked about earlier today. And Congress did something very interesting. 1972, a democratically controlled Congress decided to pass a law that gave Richard Nixon, the president at the time, the authority to set wages and prices and do wage and price controls in the United States of America. This is a remarkable power that presidents had never had before. And President Nixon, being a Republican and being market-oriented, said, well, we're not going to use something like that until he started to worry about his reelection in 1972. And he said, well, you know what? Maybe we should pull out that power that Congress gave us. And so what he established was something called the Office of Cost of Living Council and the Office of Council of Price Controls. And he decided that this had to be run well, so he put two really, really smart, up-and-coming Republicans in charge of this office, the Cost of Living Council. This is the Cost of Living Council's leadership team. Anybody know who these guys are? Kind of do one of those milk carton things where you age progress them. Think hard. Team evil, team, yeah? Anybody? I got to have some guesses. They were very prominent in the last Republican administration, extremely prominent. Donald Rumsfeld is on the right, the Secretary of Defense, both during the Gerald Ford period as well as George W. Bush. This is Dick Cheney. So Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld were the Cost of Living Council's leadership team. And part of the point of my showing this slide is the fact that these guys are actually really, really bright guys, and they're very, very capable. But the idea of controlling inflation by passing wage and price controls is a flawed idea. Inflation is a consequence of an increase in the money supply, and you can have as many councils and protocols and efforts to try to have a law that sets prices to keep the price of things from going up. But the law of economics is stronger. They may as well have been trying to, have a law saying that, the sun can't set till 9 o'clock because I want to be able to, go golfing or something. The wage and price controls were a complete disaster, and inflation kept going up. As you know, President Nixon had to leave office. I think it was an illness. The voters got sick of him, but sorry. So part two, Gerald Ford comes into office, and he decides he's going to stop inflation. He goes before a joint session of Congress, and he says that the way to stop inflation is for everyone to wear little red buttons that say, whip inflation now. This was not a good idea either. It became an item of great ridicule. And one of the reasons that this was such a failure is because these ideas were never tested, even within the Ford administration. His chief of staff, who was Donald Rumsfeld, Gerald Ford's chief of staff, Donald Rumsfeld, got the whip inflation now speech. He saw it for the first time 4 hours before the president was going to give it. And he said, Mr. President, I'm not sure this is such a good idea. But he was too late. He was committed to doing it. And whip inflation now didn't work either. It wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s when the Federal Reserve began to reduce the money supply that inflation got under control, under Greenspan and others. So there we go. So one of the traps we point out in the book is the overconfidence trap. This idea that because America had been able to do so many great things in the past, that we could do anything in the future. And in fact, like this truck may have loaded on a couple of pipes too many, government takes on tasks and thinks that it can do anything. It is not the case, and we will see time and time again that one of the biggest issues is that government has been injudicious in what it attempts to undertake. So the next phase in the journey to success is design. And you can have numerous issues around design, particularly since in many cases design is done in the legislature, and it is a political process around trying to create a bill that will pass through that Stargate. In the late 1990s, California had a difficult time with energy prices. The cost of electricity was very high in California, and the governor and the legislature at the time had an idea. They said, electricity is pretty much provided in a monopoly setting. You have regulated public utilities that are monopolies, and you have certain privately held companies, but they're also regulated monopolies. And let's face it, monopolies are inefficient. If we had competition in energy prices and allowed people to buy energy on a free market, that should drive prices down, increase innovation. The idea is actually somewhat sound, right? I mean, that is how markets tend to work. They tend to be more efficient. So that was the goal, was to lower energy costs. They introduced an energy reform that allowed people to do buying and selling of energies. The problem was the legislation was very, very complicated. It involved transmission had to go over on state-controlled transmission grid. There was a California power exchange. There were price limits in the reform that limited the amount of prices that you could charge for certain types of electricity, and then it created a spot market for other types of electricity. Bottom line, it was really, really complicated. Do you know who figured it out? Who figured out California's energy system? Enron. Who said that? Very good. Enron. The energy trading guys at Enron who said they're the smartest guys in the room. They figured out how to game it. One of the cool things about electricity is electricity travels at the speed of light. So they would have all these scams involving, they would actually sell electricity they would buy electricity from California at a very low price, ship it outside of California, send it around the western grid through Colorado, and send it back into California at 10 times the price. Instantaneously. It's the same electricity, right? It's traveling at the speed of light. But because of the nature of the contracts and going off the grid and then back on the grid, they were able to basically rip off California to the tune of billions of dollars. They also found out that if you take your energy plants offline, you can actually make more money because you create an energy shortage. So they started to have rolling blackouts in California. And the California electricity, it's called deregulation or reform, was such a fiasco that they ended up recalling the seated governor at the time, Gray Davis, which gave us the governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Wonder what he's doing these days. I have no idea. Haven't heard of him since he left office, really. But it ended up costing $40 billion for California consumers. And this is where the story of California electricity deregulation gets incredibly scary. That stuff I just told you is just partly scary. What's really scary is it passed, here's Enron, it passed the legislature 98-0. Not a single legislator in California, which is split 50-50 Democrat and Republican, or maybe 55-45 Democrat, uniformly, not a single legislator voted against it because they didn't understand it. The complexity was enough. They wanted the goal of lower energy prices, but they did not understand the complexity of what they were setting up. So that legislative design that they put together was incredibly, incredibly flawed. This is kind of a depressing talk because I talk about all the ways government can screw up. But I give this talk to public officials a lot of times because being aware of the ways you can screw up is actually very, very important in trying to get success. So Stargate, I talked about Stargate. Stargate is about getting something to pass politically. And one of the things that occurs in the way that this journey occurs is that it's the politicians who are dealing with things in the idea phase and the design phase, right? It's legislators, it's governors, they're talking, they're manipulating legislation, they're making amendments, they're doing things. And for them, getting something through Stargate, once it gets through Stargate, that's when they have their party. That's when they have their success, right? That's the last phase in the journey as far as they see it. Because once a bill is passed, then they go on to doing the next bill. Which is why you have so many cases where you have legislators or legislatures that think that their goal is to get a bill passed. Because if you get a bill passed, you get to have a bill signing. That's the Stargate from the TV show. I went to MIT. I think Dr. Nash mentioned that, and I'm a geek. And so that's why we named it the Stargate. So let's look at the goal of energy independence. This is President Ford signing the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1974, where the goal was energy independence and to reduce the amount of foreign oil that we would import. 7 years later, net imports of oil were 400,000 barrels per day higher than they were when President Ford signs the bill. Not to be discouraged, we can sign more bills. Jimmy Carter in 1978, he signs the Energy Act of 1978, and his goal was to put, and this was, I don't know if you remember the Carter speech, it was almost as famous, he says, by the year 2000, we want to have 20% of our energy coming from the sun. 20% solar-powered energy. We missed by this much. By 2000, the sun was providing 0.007% of all the energy used in the United States. He didn't get a ticker tape parade for that one. But don't despair. We can have more bills. President Bush signs the Energy Policy Act of 2005. The goal is energy independence and economic security. And the signing of this bill led to the Energy Independence Act of 2007. I don't know why he got to sign 2 bills in a row like that. And now, of course, we all enjoy low energy prices, energy independence, and I don't think we use any oil anymore. Does any? My point here is that passing a law is not the same as actually achieving your results. But the way our political process is set up, there's a lot of celebrating that gets done upon the signing of a bill. There's a lot of political positive feedback from the people who want to see various bills passed. All of these bills have a lot of stuff in them that people really, really enjoy. I think that the first Bush Energy Act had a provision in it to encourage the use of biofuels. So the idea was that if you if you were using energy to create electricity and you were to add biomass into it as a mixture, you would get a subsidy from the federal government of 50 cents a gallon. This is to encourage the use of biofuels. This is one of those subsidies that government does to try to encourage things that the market won't support. So the goal was to try to get people to add some corn to gas and other diesel fuel kind of uses to make that biomass fuel better. The only problem is there were some guys up in Maine who run paper mills. And one of the things about the pulp making process is it creates this byproduct just as part of the chemical process called black liquor. And since like the early 1900s, paper mills in Maine and elsewhere would take this black liquor and use it to create all the energy and electricity to fire and run their very high energy using paper mills. Very energy intensive process, making paper. So what they did is they read this bill and they said, if you take oil plus biomass, you get 50 cents a gallon. Subsidy. I know what we'll do. We'll add this much oil to our black liquor that comes out of the pulp process. We'll fire our plants. These companies were getting hundreds of millions of dollars of subsidies for doing something that they've been doing for 100 years. Was this intended in the legislation? No. However, once something like that gets into place, it's very hard to get it out. And that's part of the what they call the law of unintended consequences. Whenever you pass something complex, people will look at it and try to use it for their benefit as opposed to what you intend, and the possibility exists that you will get results other than those that you are hoping for. What else we got? Oh, okay. So there's a number of examples of this kind of thing. No Child Left Behind was massive federal education legislation that was passed in 2001. 90% of the Congress voted for it. George W. Bush was in favor of it, so was Ted Kennedy. You can't get 90% of Congress to agree on what day of the week it is. They were all behind No Child Left Behind. Here it is 10 years later. Our public schools have had no improvement. No one likes No Child Left Behind anymore. You can't find anyone in Washington, D.C. who says it's done what we set out to do. I talked a little bit about the energy, the biofuel, electric vehicles. This is another example. They wanted to subsidize electric cars. So they said, anybody buys an electric vehicle, you get $5,000 rebate. So you're trying to encourage the sale of these kind of expensive cars like the Prius and stuff like that. The only problem is there are these guys down in Florida who make golf carts, which are electric, and they realize that if you make them roadworthy by adding a rearview mirror and a seat belt, that you are capable of getting a $5,000 rebate. Now these cars go for about $8,000. So these golf cart manufacturers were selling $8,000 cars and getting $5,000 rebates for their company, for their customers, and giving them the $5,000 rebate, and basically, their sales went up, and it makes no sense. That wasn't what you were trying to do with this legislation. I think there's a huge question as to whether a lot of the programs in the war on poverty have achieved the results that President Johnson was looking for when he passed many of them. Children and babysitters. In 1987, do you guys remember the day? Were you guys born then? No, you weren't born then. Okay. Okay. You guys don't remember that. That was the day that 7 million American children went missing. It was April 15th, 1987. 7 million American went children. You guys looking at me like, no, you're lying. That didn't happen. Yeah, it did. It did. April 15th, 1987. How did it happen? Anybody have a guess? April 15th? What happens on April 15th? No, April Fool's Day is April 1st. I don't know what state you're from. Taxes are due. You guys probably haven't paid taxes yet. You will. You will. Oh, that's coming later in the presentation. You guys are going to pay a lot in taxes. April 15th. 1987 was the first year, if you have as most of us know, if you have a child, you get to get a child deduction. You get to save money in your taxes if you have a child. April 15th, 1987 was the first time that the IRS required that you write down the child's Social Security number. And the first day that they did that, 7 million American children went missing. They disappeared. There were 7 million fewer children getting tax deductions in 1987 than there were in 1986. That worked so well, the IRS decided 2 years later that another tax credit they give people is that if you pay someone to do babysitting for you or child care so that you can go to work, you get to deduct that expense as well. Well, in 1989, April 15th, the government said, yeah, you can still take your deduction, but you have to write down the Social Security number of that babysitter. And on that day, 2 years later, 2 million babysitters disappeared. Now, I always like to think of the 7 million missing children and the 2 million babysitters off in a beautiful scam land where they're playing on the spring, going for walks and playing in meadows with pink ponies and things like that. So you oftentimes get results other than what you're looking for because people scam the system. This is, you guys anybody here who know who Leroy Fick is? He's been in the news a little bit lately. This is a guy who, he was on the food stamp program. He had the bridge card to get food assistance. And a year ago, he won $2 million in the Michigan Lotto, but he still collects his food stamps. And so, oh my gosh, well, let's call the director of health and, Department of Economic Security in Michigan and say, what's going on here? And they go, well, under federal guidelines, lump sum payments aren't counted in eligibility assessments. So Leroy Fick and his brand new Audi convertible and his brand new home gets his bridge card and he goes shopping on your dime and my dime and everybody who lives in Michigan and federal program dime. So the idea of passing a law that has the name like, the Sunshine and Roses law doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have sunshine and roses. No Child Left Behind doesn't mean you're going to have No Child Left Behind. And you need to work that process all the way through the implementation and results stage. And I'd love to see politicians held more accountable for the end results than for passing laws. What else do we got? Implementation. I don't think I'm going to talk too much. We did the survey. 16% of the senior federal officials said that the federal designed legislation created policy that can actually be implemented. So this would be the equivalent of us surveying builders and only 16% of them saying that the architects were producing plans that could actually be built. Right? I mean, you turn over the blueprint to these senior executives to execute these policies. 16% said that they were designs that could actually be implemented. Extremely high challenge on executing things. I want to talk a little bit about some of the barriers to part of what I do on the website Better, Faster, Cheaper is look at government that does try to do things innovatively and to save money. And there are a lot of good folks in government trying to do that. And we try to highlight those successes. And I think that, when we talk about some of the struggles of government, we need to remember that there's reasons that these things are happening. It's not that people in government are indifferent or ill-equipped. But one problem is that there's no single measure of success. In the private sector, if you're profitable, it means that you're serving your customers and using less in resources than it takes to please those customers at the price they're willing to pay. You earn a profit, you're good. How good is the local fire department doing? Great. How about the local library? How about the Child and Family Protection Services? How do you measure these things? How do you tell? You sometimes know how much they cost, but how do you measure their impact? It's this vague set of anecdotes. They try to put some measures around these things, but it is extraordinarily difficult to measure the success of any government entity, to compare government entities, right? Because for the most part, police departments, libraries, many of the functions of government exist at least as local monopolies, and it's very, very hard to compare across jurisdictions to get feedback. So the corollary of that is there's no feedback on performance. In the private sector, if you're not serving your customers well, you will get feedback in the form of losing customers. If you're doing a great job, you will get that feedback in the terms of profit and more customers. And that feedback is both painful and pleasant, right? And it causes things like Eastern Airlines. You've never heard of Eastern Airlines. It was the biggest airline. They used to have ads on TV that said, "We earn our wings every day." Well, sometime in the mid-'70s, they stopped earning their wings, and they're gone. They used to win all the customer satisfaction surveys every year, but they couldn't make a profit. So they disappear. In government, there is no feedback on performance. You're going to get the same thing all the time. Managerial uncertainty and turnover. Could you imagine if, take a company, IBM, General Electric, General Motors, whatever, if every 2 to 4 years, 4 years for the most part, I guess, for the president and governors, that the entire senior management team of General Motors were to be wiped out and replaced by a whole bunch of new guys? That's what our federal government is run like. So you have, and every state government as well. Every time that there's a turnover, and even before the turnover takes place, there's uncertainty, right? If I'm working, I actually worked for 4 years for Governor Mitt Romney in Massachusetts. And it's just human nature. At around the 2.5, 3 year mark, people sit there and go, "Oh, is he going to run again? I don't think he's going to run. I don't know who's going to win. It might be a Democrat." It, in fact, was a Democrat in Massachusetts that won the next time. And so it's very hard to hold good people. And then when the new people come in, as it was the case when the Romney folks first came in, there's a huge learning curve because you're coming into a huge organization. I ran an organization of 900 people. I had to learn the policy around it. I had to learn the people. I had to learn all this in a very short period of time. You start to try to make some changes, work with the legislature. Boom, your time is up. New guys are coming in. Time horizon, short-term versus long-term. Politicians, again, are being tested every 2 to 4 years. Their time horizon is short-term. They can't invest in things like bridge maintenance because nobody cares in the short term about bridge maintenance. What they care about is building new bridges. So as a politician, your incentive is always to not do the very cost-effective but hidden from the public good things like regular maintenance on infrastructure. It's always to build new things. And then political economy, and this is the idea of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. You guys, did somebody talk about that already? Does anybody know what concentrated benefits and diffuse costs are? Any clue? All right, so it works this way. There's a couple different kinds of this. I will do it with garbanzo beans. How much do you care about garbanzo beans? Not very much. How about you? Do you care a lot about garbanzo beans? No. Anybody care about garbanzo? Does it change your mind if I tell you that's what hummus is made out of? Chickpeas is the same as garbanzo beans? Okay. There are people who care a lot about garbanzo beans. Who are they? The what? Who? People who grow them. People who grow them. And up in Idaho, there is an organization called the Dry Pea and Lentil Association. It used to be called the Legume Association, but they changed their name to the Dry Pea and Lentil Association. These are the people who grow things like garbanzo beans. And in 2002, after years of lobbying Washington, for the first time, the 2002 Farm Bill included price supports for garbanzo beans, which I don't know about you, but I am very glad that we have ended our dangerous foreign dependence on garbanzo beans, okay? I don't want to be worried about getting my garbanzo beans from some foreign country. I want them grown in Idaho. The point is that our nation had scraped by for 225 years without having garbanzo beans being a federal program. But in 2002, the garbanzo beans have the growers have a concentrated benefit from getting such a law passed. They get hundreds of thousands of dollars a year more each by passing such a law. They now get paid a lot more than they ever did before for garbanzo beans. And you pay 1.5 cents a year more in taxes. And you don't know that it's for garbanzo bean because they don't send you a bill that says this is for the dumb garbanzo bean program. The same thing happens for the mohair subsidies that you guys pay for the sugar subsidies that you guys pay for. It also works not only in terms of the concentration of benefits to producers of certain products that get federal subsidies, but it also works geographically, right? So if, how much do you care that you paid for a parking garage in Cedar Rapids, Iowa? How much? You didn't pay very much. You paid about 20 cents or something. But the federal government, through an earmark, built a parking garage in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Now, if you're the congressman from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, how much are you psyched that there's a federal parking garage being built in Cedar Rapids that your local taxpayers don't have to pay for? Concentrated benefits concentrated to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, diffuse costs spread out over 310 million Americans. This is the political economy that drives much of the seemingly irrational behaviors and policies of government that so frustrate normal people. It's because there are people down in Washington, D.C., on K Street, earning lots and lots of money. The dry lentil and pea growing people actually hired one of the top lobbyist firms in Washington who lobbied for more than a decade to get garbanzo beans included in the 2002 Farm Bill, successfully. I could make a joke about politicians, but it's just not a good joke. All right, I'll just tell it because I heard it, but I don't agree with this joke. But in Washington, D.C., they say an honest politician is one who, once they're bought, they stay bought. But I don't believe that at all. But that's what some people say. All right. And it's, it actually doesn't matter being bought. It's really just a set of pressures. It's donations. It's the arguments you hear. It's everything is geared towards pressure to create concentrated benefits, even on topics unrelated to just pure economic self-interest. So we have at this point, really, I would argue, a government in crisis. Most government organizations are not built for the current circumstances. This lack of change, the lack of innovation that is driven in the private sector doesn't occur as much in government. But at the same time, as much as I am sometimes critical of how government sometimes operates, I think it is exceedingly important that we recognize how important good government is to our lives and how vital a thriving and healthy democracy is to peace, prosperity, and freedom. You wouldn't want to live in the Soviet Union or Cuba. Your life in Cuba, these people, string tires together and try to float to Florida in hopes that they'll be taken to prison because they don't want to, would rather do that and risk death than live in Cuba. And in Africa, the corruption and the terrific toll on peace, prosperity, and freedom is immense. So it is very important that we try as much as we can to have our government work as well as it can. There are also very important tasks that government does every day, from national defense to justice, civil justice, courts, police, basic infrastructure, and yes, a lot of the social safety net things that government does that I think that there's a legitimate role to play for those who cannot help themselves. Not necessarily people who have won the Michigan Lotto in that category, but people who are in real, true need. It's important to remember too that we have bad systems, not bad people. For the most part, I've known many politicians and people who work in government, and for the vast majority, they are good people who come in, try to do a good job every day, try to make the world a better place, but they work in bad systems, they work in bureaucracies and under constraints that make it very difficult to be effective. And I think that we need to talk about the what of government does and the how, both what should government do and how it actually operates whenever we look at government. And too often we focus on the what, whether we should have health care or not, and we don't look at the how. We don't look at the nitty-gritty of the incentives and the structures that government actually operates in. And I believe that we don't take the study of public administration nearly as seriously as we should. It doesn't make for as entertaining a fighting or screaming match on Fox or NBC or whatever those cable stations are where the people scream at each other all the time, because they're more, it's a drier topic. So what's one of the most important things we can do in government? One of the biggest challenges? The biggest challenge I think we're facing as a nation is our unsustainable spending levels that you guys are all going to have to play for. We have these are scary numbers, $14 trillion in debt. That's only a fraction of what we really owe if you take other liabilities like Social Security. That's what, $50,000 per person, $1.65. That is how much the federal government will spend this year for every dollar it takes in. So every dollar, if it takes in a dollar, it spends $1.65. That's unsustainable. We have huge deficits and debt going forward for as far as the eye can see. 2030 roughly is the point in time where all federal tax revenues will be devoted to 4 programs: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. And if you think about the year 2030, I have a young son. He's going to be just probably getting out of college around then. He's not going to benefit from Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, or interest on the debt. Nobody benefits from interest on the debt. That's a transfer of wealth from people who exist now and in the past to people your age and younger. So it is, how do you fix something like this? It is extremely scary. This is a scary graph that says the same thing, which just sort of shows that if we don't significantly change things, this red bar of net interest just goes to some just astronomical levels, because you start to borrow upon borrowing, and you'll have all sorts of the problems that Dr. Ebeling talked about earlier. Barbara Tuchman, is a award-winning author who wrote a book called The March of Folly, and she looked at several historical examples from the American Revolution to the Vietnam War to the Plague era in the 1400s or the 14th century, and she described a particular form of government failure, which she called folly. And she said, anybody can make a mistake, but for these things to be characterized as folly, they have to have 3 characteristics. One, it has to be something that takes place over years. It can't be just a single-time event. This isn't one single mistake where you make a bad judgment, you attack a country you shouldn't, or something, and you get into a problem. This is a pattern of behavior that occurs over years. Folly means not just one leader, too, right? Cuba, she wouldn't categorize as folly. She would categorize that as one destructive leader who's destroyed an island nation over the past 50 years. Whereas in America, we've had George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and you go back, for the past 5 or 6 presidents, Republican Congresses, Democratic Congresses, and in between, we have been following this course for at least 30 years. And the third thing is that to be real folly, you have to have warning voices saying that this is a problem while the problem is occurring. So in real time, people are saying, this is unsustainable, we can't do it. We have those warning government voices. The Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office, the official nonpartisan folks who look at the budget of the federal government, all of them are saying the same thing. It's unsustainable. We need massive change. We are still struggling as a government to try to come to grips with the pattern that we've been having in terms of unsustainable growth. So the road for fiscal sanity requires that we capture the idea that unsustainable really is unsustainable. We can't keep doing this. Design, we have to make changes in spending, entitlements, pensions, and government operations. The challenge is to get it through Stargate, to make a different course of action something that can actually be passed politically, to get it through Congress and the President. And the incentives right now in Washington, D.C., as I showed earlier, are pretty much all wrong. Implementation will also be a challenge. There have been efforts in the past to put debt ceilings in place. We've raised the debt ceiling 51 times since 1978. I argue that if every time you get near the ceiling goes up, there is no ceiling. Okay, 51 times we've raised it. Graham-Rudman was a spending limitation from the 1990s. They've largely been ignored. So implementing any constraint on your own spending is really hard. The result is we either have to change the way we're doing things, or our future will be looking like something like Greece or California, which is governments that can only exist with handouts from other governments. And what America really needs today is a reboot, right? And one of my favorite parts of these pillows were obviously arranged by an interior designer and not a technical person, right? So a few people understand that it's supposed to be Control, Alt, Delete. Yeah, okay, good. You guys got it. But the point is that we need to reboot our thinking about government, about what we ask it to do, and how we get it to operate. And what I think, this is a statue up near my hometown. It's the Minuteman statue at Lexington and Concord. And the sculptor of this is the same man who did the Lincoln Memorial. His name is French. This was his first public sculpture. And the thing that I love about the Minuteman statue is this is the guy who went out and fired the shot heard around the world to face off against the British. And the great thing is this is his plow. And what this symbolizes for me is that he's got his day-to-day responsibilities. He's got his family, his job, the things he's got to take care of. but he also knows that it's time for him to go out and to become actively involved in the public debate that was going on. And thanks to him, we don't have to go out there with a gun anymore. And we shouldn't go out there with a gun, right? We live in a democracy because of what he and other folks did in the founding of our nation to give us the right to set the course for our government. And so I just encourage all of you to be aware, to become informed, and to take an active part in shaping government, making government better. Because when you do it right, you can achieve great things. America is the greatest country on the earth. And we put a man on the moon. We can get back there, but we need to change the way we're doing things so we can get back to greatness once again. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Same thing with the microphone gang.
You stated that the government should be responsible for some social programs. I was wondering if you could elaborate on your thoughts on that. And do you honestly think that the government has the discipline where they can limit themselves and only give it to the people that would truly be needed?
Yeah, this is a tough question. I do believe that one of the things that I got to do when I worked in government was I got to see different venues. And one of the places I went to was a place called the Rentham Developmental Center, which was for severely mentally handicapped people. These were people who needed to be institutionalized. They were absolutely unable to care for themselves. And I do think that there is a place for government to provide some level of care or support to some parts of the population in dire need. Okay, if someone is in an accident and they go to a hospital and they don't have insurance or money, there should be a government situation that can apply immediate care so that they can at least get back on their feet. Now, do they have the discipline to limit that? And do we as a people have the discipline to limit so that we don't expand things beyond our ability, and so that we have people who shouldn't be benefiting from aid, who could take care of themselves if they did put their mind to it and put effort into it? That's a really open challenge. I think we have to scale back. I think there's more than 46 million people on food stamps today in our country, and I know part of that is the economy, but you can't tell me there are 46 million Americans who more of them couldn't be doing more for themselves. So, yeah, I do believe that there's some role for government in those things, absolutely, but at the same time, I think we've gone overboard in trying to help more people than we really can and really should. I think there's been a certain amount of aid that has had negative consequences on the recipients. President Roosevelt, when he signed the first federal welfare bill in 1935, called continued reliance on the dole a subtle narcotic of the human spirit. And I think we've seen that with some of the intergenerational poverty culture that has sprung up in some parts of the country and some areas. Other questions? Jokes? Anybody have other impressions? I do an Elvis impression. I don't know. Can I go back 2 slides?
Sure.
All right.
I can use these for you.
Okay, all right. This one? Is there going to be a test? There will be a test. Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, I got to wait for the microphone. Over here. Is it a question about garbanzo beans? Because I get those all the time.
Not at all.
Okay, all right.
Gross. No, since you worked for Mitt Romney and hasn't he announced that he's running for president, so do you think that he would make a good presidential candidate?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think that Mitt he was a very successful businessman. He ran the Olympics. He was, in every interaction I had with him, he was an individual of intelligence, integrity. I know some folks have had a lot of issue with the health care reform he passed in Massachusetts. And what I will say about that is that one of the things about our states is that they are and should be laboratories of democracy. And an opportunity, one of the things about the California electricity deregulation, that the good things about it was that it wasn't national, right? So that only California suffered from their own thing. And you know, I had questions when the healthcare reform went through in Massachusetts, but at least I could sit there and say, well, this is an opportunity to gather information about what will happen to costs, to quality, to waiting times, to all those things, because there's so many different players, insurance companies, individual patients, hospitals, physicians, equipment manufacturers. Everybody has a different angle, and everyone is usually looking out for their own self-interest. And I think that the big tragedy is that the experience in Massachusetts wasn't allowed to play out, and that any federal effort wasn't based on the learnings that came from Massachusetts. And so my fear is that the federal program, which is somewhat similar but much more complicated, you know, failed to take advantage of the fact that we could have seen what happens in Massachusetts. And if it fails or costs go up, well, we can, you know, Massachusetts has to deal with that. And yet it was a sort of a test run of a market-oriented effort to try to get more insurance out there as opposed to a single-payer plan. But unfortunately, we went with the federal version, which I think is going to make it really, really hard to, I think it's going to be really hard to implement something on a federal level given the complexity of the provision of health care. And I'm not confident that the health costs will be contained any better at the federal level than what we're seeing in Massachusetts, where the costs haven't been really contained. And you know, the people have been politically trying to characterize the Massachusetts experience as either horrible or wonderful, depending on which party you're in. And really, the truth is that it's much more mixed. It's covered more people, but it hasn't controlled costs in any significant way. It's increased some waiting times, but it hasn't been so much more expensive than projected. And it's early yet. You know, they're still having learnings and changes that are coming that I think will show whether or not they can make it work at all. But I don't know what's going to happen when it gets folded onto the federal reforms. But Governor Romney was I think he'd make a great president. And he's from Michigan. Yeah, his dad was an executive at General Motors and governor of Michigan in the 60s. And he ran for president in the 1960s. And yeah. Tim, did you have a question? Or okay.
John, oh, I'm sorry. Take my glasses off, I'm blind. John, as you look at the federal government today, and you know, you noted that the deficit is a problem, and it's a growing problem. Interest on the national debt is certainly something that is just the interest payment alone is over $400 billion last year. If you could wave a magic wand and implement a solution or two to getting the federal government to live within its means, what might you suggest?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, you know, the way the federal government always operated for the first 200 years of our history was that the federal government only expended significantly more than it took in during times of war, and then it paid it back relatively quickly. So President Truman raised taxes in order to execute the Korean War. And when it ended, they paid back relatively quickly, and any borrowing they did. And you know, we had balanced budgets so that we would, if you look at the chart of income versus outgo, you can see where the wars are. The only places that there's a significant imbalance is during the wars. And that was just an inherent cultural discipline in Washington. If you could pass an amendment or a constitutional amendment that, you know, tried to get the same type of self-discipline, that if you want to spend $4 trillion this year, fine, but you got to tax $4 trillion worth, that is, I think, the one change that changes things. Because, you know, at the local level, that's what happens. And we in our state have something called Prop 2.5. So if government wants to spend more money, they can do it. They have to go to the voters and get it approved and say, we want more money for a new library. This is what you're going to get. Sometimes the voters say yes, sometimes they say no. And some mechanism that will, you can't do that at the federal level because of the need for war, but if you could get an amendment or something that would force that, because we voters and citizens want what's only human. I want my cake and I want to eat it too. So I want high services and I want low taxes. And that's what we got with, George W. Bush passed a new benefit in prescription drugs for Medicare people. He executed wars, and he did tax cuts. What's not to like? More spending, less taxing? Oh, right, you guys are going to stuck with the bill. And that is the one thing that I would say is if you could try to get, every year you've got to be within 1% or 2% or whatever, except in extreme circumstances of war for borrowing. But it was a discipline that was inherent in our nation's capital up until, really until the early mid-70s, where it just became deficits were a winning strategy for whoever was in office. Other questions, or are we? Yes. Thanks.
Going back to the electric cars and that $5,000 rebate.
Yes.
Obviously, that got people in the door without incentive. But in the long run, do you think that hurt the government with that rebate, or do you think that actually helped those buyers out with getting into those more green energy cars?
Don't forget there were golf carts.
I know that, but like you said, the Prius, you could get into one
Right.
and get that $5,000 rebate.
Yeah.
That obviously got people in the door, but do you think that actually helped the government?
Well,
Or do you think that hurt them?
I would argue that in general, I would prefer to see the market make determinations on most types of alternative energies. It's really a lot of these energy bills that these guys were signing were attempts to artificially prop up alternative fuel sources that were not market competitive. The reason that we tend to use natural gas and fuel oil and gas, fossil fuels, is because they're the cheapest thing. If you want to create so much energy, it'll cost more if you do it through wind than if you do it through oil. It'll cost more if you do it with geothermal or the biofuels or whatever than if you use coal. The market determines that right now the cheapest source of energy is the stuff that's trapped in the ground. So in general, I am skeptical of government programs that try to get us on solar power in 1976. We just haven't gotten there. Most of these green things that you see are not self-sustaining. They only can exist with these government subsidies. And I know there's some benefit to them to try to promote the technology in those areas, and I know we are going to have to get off of green. But I would prefer to see greater taxing on some of the fossil fuels, which will make the price of them, and this is not a very Republican position, but to increase the taxes on some of the fossil fuels to make all other alternative sources of energy appear more cost competitive and increase investment in those areas a little bit more organically than trying to funnel money towards solar panels or towards weather stripping. We spent so much money on weather stripping in the stimulus bill. It was weird, literally all these weather stripping. And I don't get that. I don't think it's a good use of overall resources. I think it's trying to manipulate things through government in a non-effective way. Any other questions? Thank you all very, very much.